Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen wassalatu wassalamu ala Sayyidina Muhammad. Amma ba'd. You have a high temperature. You feel a bit ill. So you think to yourself, I'm going to go to the doctor. You tell the doctor your symptoms, that you've got a headache, you feel feverish, and the doctor, he closes his eyes and he starts mumbling to himself. And then he opens his eyes and says, you've got cancer. And you'll be cured if you give me £10,000. What would your reaction be? Would we take what he said on faith? After all, he is a doctor. Or would we question the doctor and ask, what's the evidence do you have to make such a claim? Why give you £10,000? Doesn't make any sense. Now, if the doctor stated that he feels it in his heart that you have cancer, it's an emotion that he's feeling, would you simply accept this so-called evidence based upon emotion? I think pretty much every single person will probably say, no, they wouldn't accept that. We'd simply not base decisions like on matters of health on simply emotional grounds. Similarly, imagine again, you have a kid and he goes to, he's doing his high school exams or college exams, and he comes to a maths question on integration or calculus, and it's a very difficult question, and so he simply closes his eyes and he starts thinking, or he thinks of the first answer that pops into his head and he puts that down. Is that acceptable? Of course not. The reason why I give this, and it sounds very silly answer or question or scenarios, but the reason why I give this is because many times when we ask people why do they believe in what they believe, they will either answer, well, everybody else believes it, i.e. what's occurring in society, or, which is blindly following, or what they will say is, well, I feel some emotional connection to this particular religious belief, or whatever other type of belief that the person may have. And so, if we're saying that life and death, or even just an exam, that's not sufficient methodology to establish belief, to establish the answers in a maths exam, then how can we then establish belief in our foundations? Establish our foundational beliefs, i.e. the purpose of life, on an emotional basis? Obviously it doesn't make any sense. So we have to use a process of thought. Now, some people will say, yeah, but isn't it the case that people do have an innate desire to worship? And that's true, and we will talk about this in later future videos in, I think, session 4. But we don't just allow the innate desire, this what we obviously Muslims call the fitra, the desire to worship the Creator, leave that as the guide by which we then direct our worship. Because we know that when people just use their own feelings as a basis to make judgments, really important judgments, that they'll add superstition, they'll have beliefs that are unfounded, that there's no evidence for it. And so as a result, there's no trustworthiness. Similarly, when the emotions are high, they're very religious, they really hold on to the belief and the purpose of life, but as the emotions go down, suddenly the beliefs disappear or evaporate or become less, and they have that less adherence to fulfilling what they believe they should do. So yes, the fitra, the emotional aspect, exists within human beings, but it has a relationship with the mind as well. Imam Ghazali, he gives a profound yet simple analogy to explain the importance of the mind as well as these emotions. And he gives the example, or he explains it by saying that the mind is like the jockey or the rider, and the heart or the emotions is like the horse. So you have the jockey who rides the horse. And he says that if you just had a horse and you let it go, it's going to go in all different directions. It's going to go in this direction, that direction. And if you just had a rider without a horse, then it will take him ages to finish the course. So Imam Ghazali said the best scenario, the best situation to be is where the jockey rides and directs the horse. Meaning what? Meaning thought-driven emotion, not emotionally driven thinking. So it's not our emotions leading our thought, but rather it's our thinking that leads our emotions. So when we look at this question about purpose of life, really we're asking the question, what does our thinking, what is the evidence based upon a thinking process leads us to with regards to this? And so this leads us to the topic, this big word called epistemology. Now, epistemology is used in philosophy, and all it simply means is theory of knowledge. That is to say, what is the method we use to determine the ideas we hold in the world? What do we use? What's the method that we use? Once we're clear about the method of how do we know the ideas that we hold, we can then distinguish between what is a rational thought, what is a thought that's built upon rational evidences, from an irrational one. So we need to understand what methodology of thinking we're going to use. Now, historically, there were two groups in philosophy. These are two broad groups. The first one that were known as the empiricists, and the second one were known as the rationalists. Now, empiricists, they believed that all true thoughts are derived only from experience. That is to say, that the minds are an empty vessel, or in Latin they said, tabula rasa, meaning a blank slate. And the proponents of a blank slate, tabula rasa, argued against the rationalists. The rationalists, they differed. They said we're not a blank slate. When we are born, we're not just born without any preconceptions, any pre-ideas or any previous information, but rather we are born with certain levels of innate knowledge and innate ideas. This is what the rationalists said. And so the empiricists said, no, that's not correct. And from the rationalists, I should say, they were divided into two further groups. Those who believed that the mind could answer any questions, including those questions related to the nature of what they term metaphysics. So physics is about the study or the knowledge of the world that we can sense, the world that we can observe. Metaphysics is knowledge of the world outside of the physical world. So they said, these rationalists, this particular group within the rationalists, that so long as we really think about something deeply, we develop a correct logical argument, what they called a syllogism, then we can determine all truths, whether that is the nature of heaven, the nature of resurrection, whether that is even how to comprehend the existence of God and the nature of God himself. So this was one group from the rationalists and the philosophers. Second group of rationalists believed that although we have previous information or preconcepts before experience, so before we experience something, we actually already have some innate levels of ideas or previous information, they said that the mind is still limited and thus can only conclude on a limited number of things, primarily the implications of the observed universe. And we will explain that a little later on. As for the empiricists, those who believed we only know through direct experience, as a blank slate, then this philosophy morphed into what we now know as the scientific method, and what some atheists hold, that we only know truths through this scientific method. So empiricism, knowledge through experience, we have no innate ideas, we can only know when we've experienced it. This then became, some of these philosophers then started to utilize these ideas to develop the scientific method. And some atheists, because they adopt this empiricist, naturalist and scientific or scientism, and we'll in the next video we'll discuss that in more detail, but some atheists, when they adopt this, they say therefore that if something cannot be empirically tested, meaning through the scientific method, then such an idea does not exist or is unprovable. Inevitably, this meant many empiricists believed that God's existence is unprovable. You can't prove it, as the very nature of the discussion would be to conclude on an existence of a being, i.e. of a creator, that was unsensible, unobservable, untestable. If you come to the conclusion that a God exists, that conclusion is upon a being that exists outside of the testable known universe. And therefore the proposition of God is outside of the physical world, therefore God's existence can either never be proven at all Or would they, some atheists try to argue that the existence of God is like claiming the existence of pink bunny rabbits in space? If you don't accept that, then why would you accept this? So this idea of epistemology, understanding the method of knowing the ideas and differentiating between rational and irrational ideas, is incredibly important. If this isn't clear, we don't are clear about our method of developing ideas, then our understanding of how to answer the question, does a creator exist, i.e. where we came from, will also not be clear. So we need to understand how to approach this question. For instance, you'll find many atheists, they'll say, there's no evidence for God. And you need to unpack what they're saying. They're not really saying there's no evidence for God. What they are really saying is that there is no scientific and empirical evidence for God. So this statement, therefore, has a number of presuppositions or assumptions. The first one is that science is the only method of knowing. If a matter cannot be directly observed, that means the matter at hand does not exist or is unprovable. Similarly, you'll also find many atheists claim that one day science will answer all questions about existence. We will get that one theory, the general unified theory, as some physicists say, that will answer all questions. And whether science is, so they say these things. But we have to ask the questions, okay, is that statement that science one day will answer all questions, is that actually a scientific, empirical, verifiable statement in and of itself? So many times in my own personal discussions and the debates that I've done, before even tackling the question about the evidence for God, when a person says there is no evidence for God, I have to address the issue of the methodology of thinking. Is he an empiricist who believes only science can answer all questions? Or do we expand his mind to understand, one, what is science, its role, its limitations, the axioms that it's built upon, meaning the assumptions that it has to accept, and then secondly, demonstrate that there is other methodologies of thinking, the other methods by which we can know truths, which are not termed scientific or empirical. So in the next video, we'll dive a little deeper into the scientific method and really analyze what it is and what are the assumptions and insights, and does it lead to definite conclusive ideas and principles.